Remember, it is worth 5 CPD points, so do log those. But today we've got Chris Tucker, who's going to be chairing the session, and some really great experts. And so I'm going to hand over to Chris, and really enjoyed the session. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, Susie. Yes, great. Yes, great to be with you. This is the third of 4 of the webinars that the ESG panel have put together for you. I'm just going to put actually in the chat box here a link to the ESG panel on the CIPR's website, so you can find out what else we are up to, and we hope to see you at the 4th one next month. So far we have covered in these webinars what is ESG and where next for ESG, but today's session is focused pretty much exclusively on the communicator's role in ESG, in helping organisations understand, deal with and use ESG as part of their transformation, really. We'll be talking a lot about transformational change, I'm sure. We'll be looking at the skills and attributes required for sustainability communications. We'll be looking at some real life examples of what communicators have been doing in this field and the important role that they play. We'll also be looking at understanding the key relationships that are needed, including getting internal buy-in for the ESG agenda, and how the communications professionals such as yourself can bring that about. And also, of course, risks and opportunities when it comes to ESG. So quite a lot to kind of get through. A few housekeeping issues. As Susie said, this session is worth 5 CPD points, so don't forget to bank those. We are recording the session, so there will be a recording if you have to dip out, or indeed want to listen to it again, or perhaps even share it. So there will be a recording available. Also, the CIPR are doing a lot to support PR people and professionals dealing with ESG. There is an on-demand sustainability course available for you, and also the new sustainability diploma. So you might want to look at those if this is an area you want to continue your learning in. We are going to be using the chat box and the Q&A facility on the Zoom. If you can just look at the chat box and just where you see the little 2, if you can just tick everyone, that means everyone can see the comments that you make and the points that you want to get across. So try to do that. Do tick that everyone. But when it comes to questions, it'd be brilliant if you could put them in the Q&A, because I'm going to be trying to follow the chat box and speakers and the Q&A. So I don't want to miss any questions. We may run out of time, of course, but we'll try and get as many of them in as we possibly can. So without further ado, just going to introduce our fabulous panel of ESG and PR professionals. So I'm going to start with Chaya Mistry. Chaya is the founder and director of Humanly. She's a human leadership coach and consultant. Her background is psychology, which I always think is a really great background for PR professionals. And I think we'll probably be touching a fair bit on psychology today, because we're talking about behavioural change for much of this agenda. She spent more than 20 years in PR and internal communications, including global leadership roles with Shell. So welcome, Chaya. Lovely to have you on the line today. We've then got Hilary Berg, and I've known Hilary for many years and followed her career. She spent more than 25 years now working in corporate and public and third sector organisations to integrate purpose with strategy and to campaign for change, with a focus on climate and social justice and social innovation. She's now at head of strategy at M&C Saatchi Life. But Hilary and I talk a lot about her work at Iceland, when I've described it as seminal work really in this field. So I'm sure we'll be touching on that as well. So welcome to Hilary. And then Shayoni Lynn, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Lynn. It's a multi-award winning behavioural science consultancy. And as I said, psychology, behavioural science, these are so important to us in this particular part of our work. So we'll be talking to Shayoni about that, about managing risk and opportunity in the new world of AI and misinformation. So looking forward to learning more in that emerging sector. So let's start. Do put your comments, as I say, in the chat box. Any questions, do pop them in the Q&A. So Chaya, let's start with you. What are the skills and attributes most relevant to communications professionals seeking to deal with this area, which is challenging and new to many of us.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thanks for all the introductions. It's lovely to be on this panel with amazing people as well. Just a little bit about my kind of journey around ESG and my experiences. Started, as you said, I was working in Shell. I was there for 13 years, and maybe about 10 years ago, it wasn't called ESG, but back then I was supporting the projects organization, so the EVP for projects and the chief project engineer. And when I'm talking about projects, I'm talking about like million and billion dollar projects all over the world, refineries, deep waters, asset upgrades. They're big investments, and there's always this tension around the risk of that bigger investment. And what it was called back then was non-technical risk. So NTR is what we were looking at. And if you think about the engineers who are really focused on the technical engineering solutions, this was pointing out that actually most projects that fail, and failure means it's outside the budget and outside the schedule, and sometimes it's even then a decision is made not to invest in it at all. But they failed not because they were not technically sound engineering solutions, but because the non-technical risks were missed. So things like political, regulatory, health and safety, security, environment, and all of these things sound really familiar with the ESG agenda. And I was supporting the projects organization from an internal communication perspective, which was all about people and teams and leadership, mindsets, and just enabling transformation and change. And a lot of that requires that focus on softer skills and what I call human skills. Back in those days, I was also trying to break some of the siloed thinking. NTR was not my job. My job was to get on with the internal communications, but there was such a lot of interconnection in building those sort of softer skills, that when you are building your soft skills as a leader of your organization, you're also thinking about taking time to think much broader in how you run that project, how you run that business, and how you engage with people, not only in your organization, but outside. And that takes a little bit more than just thinking around media training. We're talking about getting into spaces of coaching and creating kind of the thinking space. You asked Chris about kind of the PR skills that we need. And, we are thinking about, for organizations, reputation and also relationships. And we have to look at what actually contributes to that reputation. So here are organizations that have made promises, and I'm talking about organizations, but institutions, corporations, that there are promises around the SDGs that we haven't necessarily delivered on. And so the ESG agenda and that environment that we're in now is putting much more pressure on organizations to deliver. And when I'm talking about organizations, it's not just our brands and our assets and our, the things that we sell. We're talking about people. Organizations are, in the end, a bunch of people coming together around a common purpose. And the people who really have a big impact on that reputation are the leaders. So leaders are certainly one place that when we're thinking about our PR skills, the context is really thinking also about how we're supporting those leaders and the relationships. So relationships within the organizations, but also outside. And so organizations and individuals in the organization need to think about who am I? Who are we as an organization? How do we think? How do we then relate to each other, to our stakeholders? How are we collaborating? And then ultimately, how are we acting? And those 5 are also the categories for the inner development goals. Now, the inner development goals are a framework that has been very strongly supported by the United Nations, which are really like enablers for the sustainability goals. It's an area that I'm really interested and passionate in working in, and finding that actually when we think about leadership and the way we lead, they're key to helping folks. So I would really invite PR and comms professionals to look into that context, look into the inner development goals if there's something that helps, because they're trying to address some of the problem that's got us in the space now, which is selfishness, greed, apathy, this environment in which we've built our economies and our businesses. To get really specific on some of the skills for practitioners, a lot of what I'm talking about and thinking broader is about systems thinking, that get out of your department and your job role, think about the collaboration and think more about the systems that are at play. Understand human change, understand what the psychology of that is, and understand what journey you're taking, not only the organization through, you're not taking your brand through it, you're taking people, humans through it. So lean into that. Ask questions about risks, about the materiality assessments, non-technical risks, but this agenda, become more and more curious and knowledgeable about that space. And a really strong skill is to really think about how you're coaching, that you become a thinking partner so that we embrace that. I mean, one of the things I learned, certainly back in Shell, but in my work that I do now, is that when we come to teaching something like communication skills and leadership, it takes more than sitting in a room and learning it theoretically. So giving folks the chance to really engage in it in a place where they're putting themselves in it. And we are often in the place where we can help them to practice that skill and bring those skills to life, and hold them accountable. So, yeah, thank you. I hope that those skills help to clarify a little bit.
It's really interesting, because what everything you're saying implied to me quite a lot of self-development for the communicator before you engage with the relationships internally. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about how much we ourselves bring into the relationship, the conversation, the energy that we bring. I love there's a quote that says, your energy introduces you before you open your mouth. So when we think about our leaders and who they are, how is their energy introducing themselves? And sometimes we get stuck in this place of the way we're used to thinking. So that work on ourselves and how are we thinking, because that's what's driving how we're behaving.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to leave sort of questions at the end, but this is one definitely for you, Chaya. So Chaya, it's from Susie Steele. Chaya, from a comms perspective, is there a handy tool or a guide you've come across that explains materiality assessments? Finding I'm in a room with technical people who wax lyrical on this, and I need to understand it better. Yeah, any guidance you can give us?
Google is my friend, but to be honest, so when I worked in the projects organization, there was a course internally which was actually for engineers. It was their onboarding course. Do their onboarding courses, get yourself into their space and into their thinking. Find a buddy in your organization. I had the business advisor in my role supporting the EVP. It could be someone in HR, could be someone in the business. Find a friendly person in the organization and make them your best friend, to be that person to go, I've got a dumb question, and it's not a dumb question because I have it. Therefore, seek partnership. Sometimes there's a barrier between us as we're the advisor, but we're not in a learning and open-minded space in in that kind of context. So, find someone who you can really just use as a place to learn.
That's really interesting. I remember my person was an investor relations person who I stuck to when I worked in banking, and I learned a lot that way. It was a good point. Quentin, so I didn't introduce you, Quentin. Quentin Langley is also on the ESG panel.
I think we often have the Dr. Watson role of we ask the questions that the public wants to see asked, and therefore the fact that we are not technical experts, and the fact that we don't view things the way a company like Shell, where I also worked, does, of, these are our plans over the next 30 or 40 years. If you start making green claims, Shell or BP may genuinely expect to deliver within 40 years, but the public is hearing, you're doing that next year, are you?
No, absolutely. No, that's a really, really good point. And in fact, there may be a bit of a cover if you feel you're asking a stupid question. These are the questions our stakeholders are asking. And I'd like to know too.
We can give them a chance to practice their thinking before they're speaking.
Yeah.
Because we often focus on what they're speaking about. We should be practicing on what they're thinking about as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to Hilary. Hilary, I hope you won't mind sharing your experiences. If you can talk about current clients, you can change names, but I know you could certainly talk about Iceland. And interesting to hear, you know, from a point of view of working with some of these big names, what do you see as being the role of the communicator, and how can we affect change?
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here. I've just had a sign come up on my machine saying your network bandwidth is low. So if there is a crisis, somebody send me a message and let me know. So for the last 20 years, I have specialised in social and climate activism, and that's taken me all over the world, from Cape Town to Kathmandu to Bangladesh. And I now am using that experience to try and develop transformative sustainability strategies. And by that, I mean ones that try and shift systems to try and find new ways of working. And as a PR person, I've got a lot of experience that tells me without doubt that we are very, very well placed to make a difference to the agenda. But to set the scene, you know, we're facing this series of wicked problems, and that's in the academic sense. They seem like they're impossible to solve, dominated by global warming, but much wider than that. And so one of the first things you have to do is explain what sustainability is. And sustainability is simply the ability to keep on going. So that's what the dictionary says. So for your organisation, maintaining trust and recognising risk and future-proofing, for your people so they have the best jobs possible and they can be fulfilled and do their best work, and for the planet so that future generations have got a place to live that actually can actually support society. But don't let's kid ourselves with what's coming, because if we don't all take radical action, you know, we're going to see hundreds of millions of lives lost within our children's lifetimes. We're going to see the breakdown of society as we know it. This could not be more serious. And that's before we even get to the existing issues about social inequality. And no business will survive in the long term without being ahead of the game. And that's the kind of core message that we've got to carry inside the business. It literally is adapt or die. It all sounds really depressing. But there are reasons to be hopeful. One of the reasons to be hopeful is us, actually. We are a whole army of people who've got unique and special skills in this space. But what we've got to do is get upstream of the issues. So at the moment, communications people are not always involved in strategy. We can be at the very end of the chain where you just get given a brief to communicate a new plan or a product or a piece of news. And that's not only a massive lost opportunity for the organisation, but it's where greenwashing creeps in. And that's really bad news. And I think there's more on that in the next webinar, so I won't dwell on it today. So what can we do? Well, our first big skill in this space is actually horizon scanning. We are brilliant at seeing the big picture, at looking at reputational and operational risk in things that are happening. And that means we can assess materiality, which has just been mentioned. That just means looking at material risk. We can actually help to assess that, and that means we can help set direction. Now, organisations have traditionally looked at risks from the outside in. So what's happening in the world that impacts us? We can now turn that around. We have to. What's happening in our organisation that's going to impact the world? And the best materiality assessments simply look on one side, what are these big issues that are important to our stakeholders? And on the bottom axis, you know, what are the big issues that are affecting us? And you can plot where all these issues sit, and you can pick the most important ones. Now, we can actually help analyse that risk because we've got a special relationship with stakeholders. So we can actually have a relationship with them, we can map them. And if you map stakeholders in the context of sustainability, that's quite different. They're much more diverse than if you map them in the context of traditional business strategy. So for the Iceland Foods palm oil campaign, where we set out to draw attention to the sustainability issues around palm oil, we actually mapped 11 different stakeholder groups where normally we would map 5 if it was a normal business conversation going on. And we did that over the course of a year. And the comms team and along with the sustainability team actually looked at hundreds of pieces of evidence to pull that stakeholder map together. It also goes without saying that PR people should be absolutely obsessed with ethics we should, you know, you shouldn't be in the job unless you're obsessed with ethics. And we can't own sustainability strategy, but we can be a guiding light. Chaya's already mentioned it. We can provide really great leadership counsel to get it right, and strong supported leadership is really important. But to do that, you've got to be really well educated, and that includes being educated on the tidal wave of regulation that is coming. Again, I think that's been talked about in other webinars, but that presents a real risk to business and a real tangible issue for comms people. You've also got to be able to speak the language of the boardroom. So every single conversation you have in there has got to be well evidenced and logical, and you know it's got to be commercially sound as well, and moral. But if you go in just with a moral argument, it won't wash. You won't get people's attention. It's got to be all of those things. You've also got to fight back on greenwashing, and that can happen at all levels in the organisation. So part of our job is to be the person asking the hard questions. That's when comms people come into their own. In my experience, once you've got credibility in the conversation, you can massively push the agenda, and you can move it from being about nudging change and risk management to actually bold action. That needs courage. Courage also comes into play when you have to deal with external criticism. And particularly if you go down the route of brand activism, which Iceland did with plastic and palm oil and other things, you've got to be super well evidenced. You've got to be on good legal ground, but you will rattle people's cages and you will upset big lobbies, and they will come for you. And so in my experience, my worst experience of that was literally lawyers knocking on my door, giving me personal legal threats from somebody that I'd upset. But at Iceland, what we saw was astroturfing, and I don't know if Shayoni might talk about this, but that's when corporations or governments create fake community organisations that appear to campaign against you, and that happened at Iceland. It happened on social media, and it happened in paid media as well, traditional media. But back to our superpowers. Relationship building. I've said we can map out stakeholders, but we can actually engage with them. And the big thing we can do is bring them around a table to convene, because wicked problems can be solved, but they can only be solved by people working together across sectors to innovate and look at systems change. We can do that. We can push it even further because we can co-produce solutions. So we can work with customers and colleagues. And believe me, people at the grassroots of any organisation, whether that's out in the field, in retail operations, or it's somewhere in the supply chain, they know what the issues are, and they know often what the answers are. So we can actually work with them. You just have to ask them. You can co-produce solutions with them. And that also links with our creativity, because it means we can unpick systems and change them. A really good example of that is Iceland Foods have got a microcredit scheme, and there's a big story attached to that there isn't time to go into, but more than 12 million people in the UK can't access affordable credit. 1 in 5 people. Lots of Iceland customers can't. So when the benefits system is messed up and their incomes can go up and down without warning, they need access to microcredit. There isn't any. Based on an idea that I saw in Bangladesh, we developed a microcredit scheme with partners around the table, backed by the Treasury. That was launched last August. 50,000 people applied in the first 3 weeks, and that's for a £25 loan up to £75. And those people as well, when you look at social impact, they're not using food banks, 80% reduction in use of loan sharks, 65% of people with better diet. So that all works. Another big gift that we've got is to change the way people think through storytelling. That means we can inspire and give people hope. There's an amazing thing called a heuristic of availability, back to psychology, and that means that you can't really act on anything unless you can imagine it in your head. And all the conversations about sustainability are disaster. You can easily imagine that. We need to change that. We need to flip it. We need to give people hope, paint a picture of a better future, and tell them how they can be actually involved in it. And the final skill we've got is looking to our colleagues. So first of all, sustainability strategy has to be built into business strategy. Your best friend is the lawyer, actually, the internal legal team, but also you need to be with technical, HR, buying, whoever's relevant in the world that you're in, estates. But bigger than that, Chaya's already said, there's an Elon Musk quote, there's no such thing as a business. It's just a bunch of people pursuing a goal. The secret weapon at Iceland was colleague power, without any shadow of a doubt. There's a great scheme there called Talking Shop, which means there's an open door between the boardroom and stores. If anybody wants to know about that, I can talk about it more. That meant we could make actual people the engine room of the strategy. Don't see people as a column in your plan that you have to attend to. Put them right in the middle of the strategy. It's just amazing when you do that. So at Iceland, we had people coming up with schemes like they were buying eco cleaning materials, they were turning the store lights off at night, they were suggesting ways to change things. But the biggest learning from working with people at Iceland is 30,000 people living in the most deprived communities in the country. They knew more about deprivation and poverty than anybody else. And what they did was put it right on the top of the agenda. So, 32 million people in the UK are excluded from ethical purchasing decisions because of cost. So they actually changed our agenda. So we made it about democratizing sustainability, so that we made sustainability as affordable as we could to absolutely everybody. When you empower people like that, great things happen. I think I'm probably run out of time now, but there's a guy in Belfast in COVID sitting on a till. He invented Elderly Hour. Within a week, it was in every Iceland store. Within 2 weeks, it was within every supermarket in the country. Sally Ann Morgan in Newport store fought the board on sustainability strategy because she wanted nature engagement for children in poverty right in the middle of it. We seconded her. She developed a campaign that actually generated 750,000 hours of nature engagement for kids. So we can help manage risk. We can build an ethical agenda. We can support our leaders massively to inspire change. We can get everybody to understand the issue. We can give people hope, and we can contribute directly to product and service innovation. So imagine yourself 30 years from now, it's a cleaner world, nature's thriving, kids aren't going hungry, life isn't a postcode lottery, and we've got a dynamic role in getting to that place. The choice is yours. You can be an agent of change, and you can actually give sustainability, credibility and energy and ideas and life. So that's it really. I mean, this is our moment, isn't it? I'll stop talking.
Fantastic, very, very uplifting and inspiring. And I love the reference to our superpowers. I'm sure we'll all like that. But a lot of things you were running through there, the things we associate with professional strategic PR, it's just maybe it's pressed a bit harder on all of them, really. This is the time to use them. One thing, something that came through, not from what you said, but also from what you said, but what other people say too, is the importance of internal communications in driving change. I mean, was that your experience? Because I mean, these promises could be made and these aspirations could be stated, but at the end of the day, it's the people who make it happen. So would you say the shift is more that way now?
I think it's about engagement, so internal comms, but it's about colleague engagement, like true engagement, two-way. With Iceland in particular, the experience of involving colleagues was fantastic. They massively influenced the strategy, and they came up with amazing ideas, but they also tested everything. So for instance, the Healthy Start scheme, which is gives low cost, free food and milk to mums who are on a low income, very low take up in the UK. And what we did was put that scheme on 90 million milk bottles. So it went straight into people's homes and they could see if they could apply for it. That was all driven with colleagues, and colleagues who are mums in those circumstances actually helped me define the communications and tested everything as well. So they were actually collaborators in the whole process.
Fantastic. So harnessing the power of your colleagues, wonderful. Shayoni, should we move on to you and I was going to say the brave new world, or maybe your frightening new world in some respects. But tell us about the work that you've been doing in this area, and also some of the risks. So we've touched on some of the risks, but I know that's something that you're particularly working on.
Yes, Hill has been very uplifting. I'm going to bring the mood down, so sorry about that. So I'm Shayoni, I'm CEO of Lynn. We're a behavioral science communications firm. We're just coming up to 4 years. We have 3 practices of the business: Lynn Health, Lynn Planet, which is the hat I'm wearing today, and Lynn Change. So we do quite a lot of work through the lens of behavior change at local, national, and global level on climate change and sustainability. And it's really interesting because at Lynn, we call ourselves, our strapline is powered by behavioral science. So if we are all about creating good behaviors, which is good for our society, the flip side of that is how do we protect those behaviors? And talking about risk and talking about things that as communicators, we need to be cognizant of. I think one of the specific risk areas that I've been talking about for the last 12 to 18 months and will continue to do so is the real threats from disinformation and how that ripples down through to organizational projects and really strong innovative policies that will get us to save our planet, but are being completely appended by disinformation. And I think it's really important to, this is where I'm going to scare everyone, so sorry about this, but I think we all need to be cognizant of the scale of the problem. It's disinformation as an industry is vast. The scale is overwhelming if you think about it. It is organized, it is sophisticated, it is weaponized. It is a group of people, and well, call them actors, who are both state and non-state, who are exchanging money and have a specific agenda to create chaos. And they are doing this to obviously further their own purposes and worldview, which is about disrupting democratic processes. So when we look at disinformation, which is the proliferation of false information with bad intent, which is different to misinformation, which is the proliferation of false information, but without intent. But if you see where I'm coming from, for misinformation to exist, disinformation needs to exist first, right? And I think when I talk about disinformation, and the reason, I probably should have said, the reason we have this interest at Lynn is we founded 2 years ago the Misinformation Cell, which was the UK's first dedicated anti-mis disinformation service for PR and communications. And that cell has been really well received. We have conversations on local through to global levels on various challenges spanning health, climate, sustainability, democracy, et cetera, but they all intersect. And I think when I talk about this with colleagues, whether in the UK or abroad, communications practitioners are still seeing disinformation through a very tactical, reactive lens. It's through the lens of social media, and it's a very reactive response. So when something happens, when something goes viral, when there's negative response to content that we've put out, so a very tactical piece, how do we respond to that? So we're still very much circling around the waters of moderation, as opposed to thinking of it as a real business risk or organizational risk that can really disrupt policy and agenda. And all this while, disinformation actors who are, again, very sophisticated, have a real understanding of human behavior. So not only are they great communicators because they can create content that can really resonate, but they're very good at understanding human vulnerability, and they're radicalizing our audiences in front of our eyes, right? And so our response needs to really shift from that reactive, how do I deal with this on my social channel, to how do I adopt a more proactive approach to this? How do I get ahead of them? How do I threat assess before it becomes an issue? And we are seeing disinformation specifically in the climate and sustainability space, but also health, and they intersect, as you can imagine, quite a lot. We see this as a burgeoning area which will fall out of the purview of communications and move into risk and compliance, because this is about protecting organizations and needs to be embedded within strategy. So in Chaya, you're talking about, it's quite downstream, and we're often given briefs that we then need to go and execute. Well, in order for us to get to that space of, decision making at that top tables, we need to be able to articulate why some of the threats we see on the horizon, going back to your Hill and horizon scanning, is part of business reputation, organizational reputation, revenue, purpose, impact, et cetera, So we are having lots of conversations, which in some ways is both positive in that people are understanding the scale of risk and willing to invest in providing sustainable response, but also very depressing that the scale is as vast as it is. Across the portfolio of climate change and sustainability, whether that is 15-minute cities, whether that's active travel, whether that's food waste, the whole gamut of work being done to create a more sustainable future for us all is being hit by disinformation. And the ripple effects are quite significant, not just in an external capacity, because of course it will have an impact on how your audience views your organization, whether they adopt the behaviors you want them to adopt, whether, and knock-on effect of them not adopting those behaviors. The more systemic problem, I think, is the potential, the disruption can really dilute these policies, which are so important to save our planet. So I keep going back to that. So 15-minute cities is a great example of global disruption, and it's organized disruption. And this is now spooking politicians who don't want to make the wrong decision to their electorate, and they're losing the confidence to take forward some of these really important policies. And the knock-on effect, of course, we know what that looks like. And the other thing I want to briefly touch on is the importance of understanding our internal audiences. So you talked about that, Chris. I think, when we talk to clients about behavioral science or disinformation within climate change and sustainability, the focus seems very much on their external audience. How do we get them to change their behaviors? How do we But really, the consequence of not, I suppose, using the same treatment for your internal audience can be quite significant. We spoke to a local government recently who actually we had warned about some oncoming disinformation on the horizon, and at that point weren't taken quite seriously. But they have circled back, which is good. But the knock-on effect into the internal workforce is significant. There's huge mental health issues, there's retention issues, there's a whole host of internal problems that is a ripple effect from the external piece. And I think it's really important to be balanced in our approach to audiences and not just prioritize one or the other. Internal audiences are not homogenous. They are as much human as your external audiences. They're as much susceptible to fallacies as your external audiences. They're as much susceptible to disinformation as your external audiences, and polarization. And that polarization, if that affects you internally, can have a much significant impact than it affecting your external population. So I think that balance is really important to note.
That's fine. Victoria just made a comment, an interesting point about the knock-on effects of disinformation on internal audiences. And that, Victoria, is exactly what I was thinking. And your example there of local governments who are trying to explain some of these concepts to local people and local electorates, and then seeing the pushback that they're getting. I mean, how best to support internal staff dealing with that tidal wave of dis and misinformation when they're trying to carry out a policy of that kind?
It's very difficult, and it's very sad, but it's also reality. I think we need to confront. Hiding away from it is not going to make the problem go away. Disinformation is a significant threat and will continue to raise its profile and significance as technologies expand. So if you look at how AI, I mean, even in 3 months, the expansion of AI has been mind-blowing, right? I mean, what you can do now with AI versus 3 months ago is a whole different kettle of fish. Now, not very far in the future, we will not be able to trust non-face-to-face communication. So whether communications like this could be augmented and could be manipulated as much. So there's the risk from AI into disinformation is also significant, not one to be overlooked. In turn, we find we often go in as sort of almost like agony aunts and therapy and counsel, and it's sometimes just listening to internal audiences, internal teams, especially communications teams, but it affects policy, it affects a whole vast range of professions within any organization. And being empathetic to how they're feeling and helping explain to them and normalizing this feeling. It's not unique, sadly, to any organization. Organizations may face different scales of the problem, but when someone's attacking you on social media, it's the same feelings that we all feel, right? And also understanding that it's not just the communications team. When politicians are being affected, when CEOs are being affected, they're feeling emotional as well. And that emotional response is manufactured, right? The way disinformation actors work is they want to create that emotional reaction. So you can make emotional responses and emotional decisions that then derail strategy. So it's about understanding those mechanics and being able to really compartmentalize how we feel and thinking about a proactive solution and a strategy, ideally it's not proactive, not reactive. So you're not, misled when all of this hits, and you're prepared and you're resilient and you're able to make the right decisions with the right amount of information, which continues on that journey, which is positive and for positive societal change.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. It made me think, so Chaya, when you were talking about coaching in this area, I mean, clearly there's some coaching to be done with senior leaders who are dealing with some of this pushback, if you like, on the ESG sort of agenda. What sort of advice can you give that to those of us who are working with leaders in organisations dealing with some of these topics?
Yeah, I just wanted to also pick up on what Shayoni was mentioning about that power of connecting with internal communications. We're seeing, and we have seen for quite a while now, employee activism. And so it's much more important now to be in lockstep with internal and external. And when we are trying to change the narrative or create that change, like, we really need to look at internal change first. There's no point in telling a story about who we are as an organization if the moment that message goes out, everyone internally goes, but that's not who we are, that's not what I see, that's not what I experience. So we have to be really close. There's been historically, and I know my bread and butter was internal communications, and so there is this hierarchy. External is more important than internal. That has to end. That has to be really the ESG agenda is a really good holistic, systemic piece that helps to really be like, okay, we just need to bolster together and work together. And yes, leaders, absolutely. I mean, I'll work with leaders. Often we are responding to requests that they make because that's the relationship we've had. And I love what Hill was mentioning about kind of the data that we bring, the information that we're bringing, because we do need to be into those conversations about risk and in a way, some of that could be moving into those other departments. And I think, Shayoni, you mentioned, investor relations picking up. And this territorial fight can leave our leaders feeling like, well, who do I go to? So we need to be using our skills of coaching and building our skills of coaching. And that's really like being in a space where we're asking really good questions. We're present and we're thinking and we're exploring the challenges alongside, shoulder to shoulder with our leaders, especially when we're in a place where AI, and we are threatened a little bit by AI, that can write things for us, that can do the things that were traditionally comms jobs. But there is also this need of like moving into that risk space. That's the stuff that we can do. So let's get ourselves kind of ready for that, because that kind of failure to get ready can leave us in a space where we're sort of on the outside. We're absolutely positioned with all the superpowers, as Hill kind of described. I always felt like internally, I would say this, but I think this goes for all stakeholders, is that like we're in a position where we are we're able to hear voices and relay voices that are heard that the leader does not get to hear. Yeah. The things that I always said, people will tell their comms people what they won't tell HR and what they won't tell their leaders. And that goes for stakeholders. If we come in and we're asking questions of communications, they know we're trying to improve communication, and communication and leadership are like that. Like, I think you can't be leading well and not communicating well. These two things are skills that leaders are much more starting to see as really integrated. And I see more of that challenge in the more traditional and older industries, because when I'm working with startups and scale-ups, they totally get just how integrated that is. And we can learn a lot from the way that startups and smaller organizations see things.
Absolutely. I mean, somebody put in the chat box the importance of reputation here, and obviously senior leaders are increasingly realising their role in reputation, and obviously that should lead them to talk to us, as it's our role as well. I mean, we have that in common, and we both have that helicopter view, as it were, of the organisation. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Hilary, just wanted to ask you on the internal comms side. I mean, you had some fabulous examples there of how members of staff at Iceland have come up with great ideas. But how did you get the internal audience sort of fired up, because it must have been quite a change in strategy. We're now going to be talking about these issues. I can imagine the staff were like, why are we doing that? So how did you turn them from a why are we doing this through to actually coming out with the solutions that you talked about?
I think, well, partly I made them the starting point. So the very, very first thing that I did was to go out into the field and go out into stores and depots and talk to people. And I did that right at the very beginning, almost before I did anything else, and said, what are the issues? I actually got a really brilliant, very professional market researcher as well to help me with some of that work. And he did some fabulous work where he just went and sat in stores and talked to people. And what we found was this incredible kind of passion, really about poverty and child poverty underpinning everything. And then a kind of another tier of stuff that was about waste, people really hating plastic waste, specifically hating food waste. That was one of the biggest things, because they were very angry that food was being wasted in the context of poverty. So you started to understand very quickly what made people tick and what they wanted to see. And then we were able to actually bring their ideas in. The good thing at Iceland that was, a blessing for me is that there was a very good system in place. There was a sense of family anyway, but there was this talking shop system. So I had a discipline I could use very easily. And I actually had 1,000 extremely feisty people to deal with, but they had no problem telling me what they thought. And there were mechanisms to allow them to do it, which was very helpful.
I think that's really, really interesting. Find out what it is that your people are interested in and start with that. And clearly what you were finding was they were seeing a lot of plastic waste, they didn't like it, they were seeing a lot of food waste, they didn't like it. So you're tapping into what they care about.
Exactly that. And then there's a route the other way where we could then say to them, but actually there are these big issues that you don't know about at the moment, like stuff about commodities and palm oil and a whole load of other issues, and talk to them and get them engaged in that, and then also get their thinking and ideas on it, because they knew better than anybody how to communicate some of that stuff at a community and customer level. So it's about a kind of huge mutual respect and working together. I think what's surprising is, a lot of clients I work with or start to work with now don't have those systems. They're looking at broadcast internal comms. And one of the big shifts that actually you can really see a difference in is when you turn that into engagement. It's quite different.
Absolutely. Great. So comment here from Janine, which is on stakeholder groups. So I'm kind of inclined to give it to you, Hugh, because I was going to ask about, you talked about 5 stakeholder groups normally, but then 11, and I was wondering how you sort of got to that. And Janine is saying, we're an SME and late in the game doing a materiality assessment now, but I wonder, does it make sense to include all stakeholder groups from the very beginning and the early stages of the materiality assessment, or should we initially focus on the most important ones, such as staff, customers, management, board? So it sounds like you might have started on with those, but then you moved out. So I don't know, what would your advice be to Janine?
I think if you're talking about sustainability issues, then you have to start with all of them. So I would be actually mapping, it's literally that grid. What matters to, who are our stakeholders, what matters to them, and what matters to us. But you also have got to be clever in how do you find out what matters to them. And what you find, particularly if you're dealing at community level or anything political, that there are always siren voices, the loudest voices. They don't necessarily represent everybody at all. So you've got to think about how you do that piece of listening. Where the prioritization comes is with the comms delivery. If you've got limited time and money, you need to start prioritizing where you put that. But the actual analysis piece and the intelligence, I think you need to do that in a more comprehensive way.
Susie, you were replying to Janine's comment as well about a client that you were talking to. So you've had this issue as well about stakeholder identification and segmentation.
And really, for us, when we're advising, it really depends on the type of business, because this particular client was going very far and wide, and I think, and it was their first experience of doing this, and actually the type of industry they're in, they wouldn't have got a lot of value from engaging with some of the stakeholders that they were talking about. It wouldn't have made a material difference to what they had to achieve. So, you know, we advise that they really concentrate on the ones that, you know, were most important. But I think it really depends on who the stakeholders are who are relevant to what you're doing. It depends on the type of industry you're in, the type of impact you're having. So it really depends. And that's where, you know, understanding who they're communicating with and who they're having an impact on is really important.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, really just making what makes them tick. Sorry, Quentin.
It depends what you want your stakeholders to believe as well. So you work backwards from what you want them to believe and therefore what the messages are. So when I was at Shell, for example, the target belief for employees was, I'm proud to work at Shell. Therefore, what do you need to convince people of to have them believe that? The target message for, or the belief for, say, Greenpeace or other activist groups was never going to be Shell's fantastic. The target belief was, well, if someone has to do it, I suppose it had better be Shell.
Yeah. So start with what they know, what you need them to know, and then, you know, work from there. Yeah, brilliant. Shayoni, can I just come back to you, because a lot of what you were talking about is going to be, you know, is still relatively kind of new to us, to many of us. Where should we start when it comes to understanding this world of disinformation and misinformation? Because we clearly need to get ahead of it. I mean, is there anywhere we can obviously start to, you know, to upskill?
I think so acknowledging the scale of the problem is always a really good place to start. So we're not seeing it through a very narrow lens. So what we're seeing on our social media profiles is the best and quickest way. Understanding the impact of algorithms and how they are created to boost engagement, whatever engagement it may be, often negative, and how therefore refuting disinformation with the noble purpose of trying to come across with solid fact is not necessarily the right action in all circumstances. Acknowledging that the emotions that we feel when we see dis and misinformation is okay, it's normal, and it is created to trigger such responses, and not responding within that emotional parameter, and taking time to really reflect and understand the risks versus rewards of any action as a result of direct disinformation. I think those are sort of things we can do. Fact checking is a good thing, not always the solution, because where we're looking at disinformation is rooted, the organized campaigns of disinformation are so heavily optimizing good understanding of human behavior that they play to very core beliefs around identity. And if we have strong beliefs about something which is then being amplified by our social networks through misinformation, so people we trust are sharing in our beliefs, it's very hard to get people to see differently through fact alone. So the importance of storytelling and fighting disinformation is really important, one not to be negated. We aren't going to win this war with fact alone. We have to think about how we can creatively come up with ways to become a trusted messenger for our audience. And I think that word trust is really important. It's in decline everywhere. So how do we build trust in this polarized, divisive, constantly shifting world? You know, how do we ensure that our voice is authentic, and how do we partner with voices similar and shared purpose to ours? So those are things to consider. Upskilling, I'd say this is, although disinformation, like with behavioral science, has been in some shape or form in our society as long as we've probably lived. The theory, the academic knowledge coming out of it is quite in its infancy. So there's a lot of, like, for us, particularly working in this space in 2 years, we are constantly having to change our approach, constantly having to enhance our approach, because it's just, we're creating it. We're creating the solutions alongside other partners. I mean, globally, from a commercial perspective, disinformation services provision is more towards macro analysis of social media content. So very much like social listening, but through the lens of mis and disinformation. Some tools can give you, through predictive modeling, can give you sort of the percentage of risk you face of this going viral, but that necessarily doesn't provide actionable intelligence in what you do when that happens, and how do you integrate those insights back into communication strategy and outputs. So our approach is very different. Although we have AI solutions, ours is more bespoke around what is the problem at hand, who are the people we're trying to communicate to, what are the behaviors we're trying to create, maintain, change. So it's a very different approach. So from an upskilling perspective, the practical information into how to use some of this is limited, but I would say resource-wise, definitely go to Lynn. We do loads of thought leadership on misinformation and behavioral science, lynn.global. Or the other space to look at is Government Communication Service. So they have a couple of resources which is really useful. There's Resist as a framework, which is around rapid response to the information environment. And there's also Wall of Beliefs, which is a new diagnostic tool, very much along the lines of stakeholder analysis, Mendelow's matrix, and that will help you understand how to prioritize the information that you're receiving from your social environments and how to respond back. I think where we've gone a step farther is operationalizing some of that and thinking about how do you take the theory and apply that into practice at pace when something is breaking, or when there's lots of nuance and context surrounding it. But very happy to take any questions, if people have anything to ask about this. I'll pop my email in there.
Yeah. Emma Livingston's just posted the Government Communication Service link to the Wall of Belief. So thank you for that, Emma. Fantastic. Well, we've just got two minutes to the end. I just want to do a quick promo for our fourth and final webinar from the ESG panel, which I'll also be chairing. We've got the Director of Complaints and Investigations from the Advertising Standards Authority and the Director of Comms for the Advertising Association. So we're going to be talking all things greenwashing. I get to ask the ASA about some of their recent rulings, and so do you, obviously. So that's on June the 8th, same time at 1 o'clock. Just got 2 minutes to go. Quick question we said we would ask. So Chaya, one piece of advice you would give communicators in the ESG arena? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, not as fast. I would say start coaching your leaders, really humanize your organization through the coaching questions and listening that we can do.
Fantastic. Hilary, one piece of advice.
I would say empower yourself with knowledge and experience, and do the same with your leaders. So get out into the supply chain, go to the farm and the factory and the waste disposal centre, get into the community, go to the food bank, and that way you'll be able to tell stories and bring the whole thing to life.
Fantastic. And Shayoni, last word from you. One piece of advice.
Don't underestimate the importance of research and the importance of buying yourself time to understand whether solutions we're putting forward are actually having an impact. And don't forget to measure that impact back to get that seat back at the table.
Good point. Measurement, as ever, comes back to that. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope to see you again on June the 8th, 1 o'clock. Link to be posted very shortly. Thank you very much, Chaya, Hilary, Shayoni. Thank you, Quentin and Susie, for your support. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
see you again soon, I hope.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.